Okay, as folks continue to come in, I'd like to welcome everyone to PMP Live. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you again to our event this evening. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format in which we strive to bring you the authors we all love to our Politics and Prose community. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be putting in the chat to purchase Life on the Line, Young Doctors Come of Age in a Pandemic. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A feature, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. We are also delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, just click on the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. Finally, thank you again for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Emma Goldberg is a reporter at the New York Times, writing for sections such as Health and Science, Styles, Gender, National and Culture, among others. Her cover stories have featured campus techlash, surgeon moms, young women running for office, and low-income medical students. Since the start of the coronavirus outbreak, she has turned her focus to the lives of students, physicians, and nurses battling the pandemic. She is the winner of the Newswoman's Club of New York Best New Journalist Award and the Sidney Hillman Foundation's Sidney Award. Goldberg received her BA at Yale and her Master of Philosophy at Cambridge University. Goldberg will be in conversation with Nicholas Kristof. Kristof has been a columnist for the New York Times since 2001. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his coverage of Tiananmen Square and the genocide in Darfur, along with many humanitarian awards such as the Anne Frank Award and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He is a regular CNN contributor with his wife, Cheryl Wooden. He has written several books, most recently Tightrope. Please join me in welcoming them both to PMP Live. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And I should say that I'm thrilled to do this with Emma. Emma isn't just a reporter at the Times. She's truly a star at the Times, who we tend to think there are about 18 of her. And so we're glad to have one of those 18 with us today. Hopefully the one who wrote the book, is that we have the right one?
Yep, present.
I'm on the family farm in Oregon. You may hear one of our farm dogs contribute to the discussion. And Emma, you were in Brooklyn, is that right?
I am, yeah, I'm here in Park Slope.
And of course, Politics and Prose is the place to introduce a journalistic book, as one of the great journalistic bookstores around the country, around the world. So Emma, maybe I can start by just asking a little bit about how this book came about, where the germ of the idea was.
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say that I am so excited to be in conversation with you, Nick, because first of all, it was really reading your books and your reporting for years that made me want to go into journalism, particularly Half the Sky, about the fight worldwide for gender equity. And also because at the start of the pandemic, I was really learning so much from your reporting. You were, I know, one of the first journalists to go into the hospitals in New York City and report on what doctors they were facing, with a really, really searing and memorable piece from Montefiore Hospital. So I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you. And I guess to give a little bit of background about the book, this book, Life on the Line, follows a group of 6 young medical students who decided to graduate early during the pandemic and to fight on the front lines in New York City hospitals, treating some of the first wave of coronavirus patients in New York. They're an incredibly courageous and really generous group of doctors who, at a time of immense stress and turbulence for them, were willing to be in frequent communication with me and sharing what they were experiencing and what they were seeing. So it really feels like this is their book, and I'm so excited to be able to introduce them to readers because I had so much fun getting to know them and getting to hear a bit about what they were seeing. So I'm just thrilled to be able to share their stories here.
And how did you choose the particular ones that you wrote about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it was really important to me to follow a group of medical students and doctors who represented in some ways a kind of new face of American medicine. Because I knew a little bit from covering the medical education and medical system for the Times that American medicine overall is pretty homogeneously white. Only about 5% of doctors in the US are African American and about 5% are Hispanic. So I knew that I wanted to kind of capture what the changing face of medicine looks like. And I also wanted to follow a group of people who were drawn to medicine for really personal reasons, and because they wanted to kind of look out for patients who looked like them, and they wanted to serve the communities that they'd come from. So I followed a young woman named Gabriella, who is Hispanic, and her mother runs a salon that was really hard hit by the economic crisis that followed on the pandemic. I followed a young woman who is modern Orthodox Jewish and was kind of wrestling with some of the questions of faith that came up for her during the pandemic. And I also followed a first generation American whose parents had some degree of skepticism about Western medicine and the US medical system. So I wanted to follow a group of people who, on the one hand, were really passionately committed to the work of this particular crisis, but who also had all sorts of underlying currents and complexities in terms of their own relationship with medicine in the US.
And so as the pandemic began, I mean, they were working nonstop. They're presumably scared, somewhat traumatized by what is going on. Was it difficult to persuade them to open up in in the ways that you managed to really chronicle them with great candor?
It was a little challenging, mostly because I felt a lot of guilt about coming to them and asking them when they were working these really, really long shifts at the hospital and coming home exhausted. And I felt guilt about asking them to then, constantly be in communication with me and telling me about what they were witnessing. And in some cases, like reliving experiences that were really traumatic. And I thought that might be sort of the last thing that they would want to do. And I had a moment pretty early on in reporting the book when one of the young women who I followed reached out to me and she said, can you jump on the phone? Actually, ASAP, I have a story that I need to tell you about right away. And it was a really challenging story about losing a patient who a few hours after he'd been admitted to the hospital, she realized that there was nothing she could do for him and he passed away. And she had this moment of questioning whether she'd made the wrong decision in signing up to graduate early and to treat COVID patients. And immediately after she experienced that, she called me up and related it to me. And I think in our conversation, she was kind of processing it and thinking aloud about what had happened and what she'd experienced and how to move forward from it. And in that moment, when she experienced this and then wanted to call right away and talk about it, I realized that there could also be some sort of opportunity for them and kind of emotional power in relating this, processing it, and then documenting it. And I do hope that in some ways this is for them a sort of archive of an incredibly challenging, but also an incredibly empowering moment in their lives when they were able to do something so tremendous. And so ultimately, I do hope that there's some degree to which it's a time capsule and a kind of helpful space and document for them.
I guess I think that doctors in particular often have to put on a veneer of kind of an emotional armor when they're around patients, and they try to convey something that is sort of the opposite of vulnerability, a sense of authority. And yet, as an author, you wanted to go through that armor and get that vulnerability and get that emotional storm within them. Was it difficult? Did you have to peel away layers, or were they willing to open up in that way?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think something that I saw in being in communication with these doctors is that I do think there's a degree to which they are representative of a kind of new generation of medicine and a new sensibility that people bring to medical care. Because this was a group of doctors who were certainly very socially conscious and also very open about their own layers of identity and their own kind of layers of processing of what sort of patient-doctor relationships they wanted to cultivate, how they wanted to cultivate trust and vulnerability in their work. So I think they were a kind of uniquely open and open-minded group. And I do think in some ways that might be reflective of what this new generation of doctors looks like, which is a little bit of a shift from the kind of older stereotypes of these authoritative figures who kind of just instructed patients on what would be best for them and didn't necessarily always lean into open conversation and cultivation of trust. I think there's been a real shift in the medical field. And there's a new real desire to cultivate levels of depth in relationships with patients. And I think I saw that in the types of communication that the doctors who I was in conversation with were open to. They were really open about their fears, their hopes, and their own vulnerabilities. And I think that's because that's a new sensibility that they're bringing to their work.
Tell me about their fears. What was going on in their minds, especially those first few months when it was, nobody really knew where this was going.
Yeah, well, I think I really anticipated that their number one fear would be that they would get sick or that, or that they would get a partner sick or something like that. And I think that was at a very base layer, something that certainly crossed all of their minds. But I was surprised by the degree to which that really quickly fell aside. I think within days of being in the hospitals treating patients, that was not their primary concern. They weren't really their own health was completely falling to the wayside compared to the kind of scale and immensity of the work that they wanted to do and their commitment to the work. And I think that was surprising for me, really inspiring to me, because I realized that they didn't for a second question that their decision to put their patients before themselves. And in fact, some of them shared that it was a little bit challenging for them to have to remember to put on all their layers of protective gear before responding to a code, for example, for like if a patient went into cardiac arrest, because they're so used to just leaping into action and doing absolutely everything that they could in the moment for the patient. So it was sort of counterintuitive to them to have to take a moment to really pause and think about how to protect themselves. But I think that the deeper layer of kind of fear and complexity that emerged for them was in the moments when there actually wasn't anything that they could do for their patients, really, because the virus was so novel. And in some cases, there weren't really treatments available. You could get a patient on oxygen, but you couldn't necessarily save their life. And I think one of the most challenging things for the doctors was not necessarily their fear for their own health, but their fear that they wouldn't actually be able to do the kind of life-saving work they wanted to. And I did get calls from some of them, like just reflecting on moments when they lost patients really soon after starting work. And they had patients who got really, really sick, deteriorated quickly, and the families couldn't even be in the room to hold their hands while they were passing. And so, and I think that was the real level of trauma for the doctors, not necessarily their fear for themselves, but their fear that there was nothing in their vein of life-saving work that they could do in some instances.
Can you share a scene along those lines from the book? Because I think that is indeed one of the things that was so unusual about the time, that young doctors, they weren't, just taking patient histories. They weren't, checking pulses. They were dealing with an extraordinary crisis and filling out death certificates and comforting people who were dying prematurely and trying to talk to family members. It was just a very, it was months from hell. So can you set a scene from us that particularly moved you as you were writing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. That was kind of one of the most challenging and really traumatizing parts of particularly those first few months in New York. And I remember one of the young doctors I followed, he from the start really told me that one of the reasons he wanted to go into medicine was because he was really interested in end of life care. And he was really interested in the ways that doctors talk to patients about when they want to forego life-sustaining measures, when they might want to transition to hospice or to palliative care. And then this young doctor, Ben, and in one of his first days treating COVID patients, he had been on the wards for a couple of hours, and he had a patient he checked in who was a middle-aged man, and he put this man on the phone with his daughter so that he could say hello now that he'd been checked into the hospital, and he seemed stable. And then this doctor, Ben, after sort of running all the tests and checking in on his vital signs, he went to go get some pizza and eat dinner. And then he heard a code. And by the time he got to the bedside, he realized it was his patient, and the patient had just passed away. And this Dr. Ben had to first call the patient's family to tell them what had happened. And then he had to sign his name. And it was the first time he ever signed his name as a doctor, and it was a certificate of death. And I think that was just a real visceral moment for him, because when you go into a field because you want to do life-saving work, you don't expect that the first thing you'll ever do is sign a certificate of death, or call a family and tell them that they lost a loved one. I think it's very counterintuitive for some young doctors to feel like they went into this field to save lives, and the very first thing they're experiencing is when they can't do that. So that was a really painful moment. And I think for him, that was just an incredibly challenging way to start his career, that, a few days into being, or a few hours really into being on the wards, he'd already confronted a situation where he wasn't able to save a life in the way he would have wanted to.
Let me ask you a question about the writing of this. I think that one of the challenges in both writing long feature articles and even more in writing books is that we as writers become close to our subjects. We like them, we admire them, they trust us, they open up to us, and then they periodically say things that maybe they shouldn't. They say something that is illuminating about them, but that they might not want in the book. And then one is in this sort of awkward situation where one knows information that, maybe readers should have, but that the subject doesn't really want to share with readers. I mean, in our last book, one of our subjects didn't really want readers to know that he was cooking meth on the side. And, I doubt if any of your doctors were cooking meth on the side, but I wonder if you had any of that sense of, conflicting loyalties, both toward these subjects who you clearly admire, respect, who opened up so much to you, but also, maybe didn't want absolutely everything presented to the reader. Did that ever come up?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it was something I was really wrestling with, particularly, as you said, as I was transitioning from the reporting to the writing, and from, I was starting to go through all my recordings and all my pages and hundreds of pages of notes, and rediscovering moments that I didn't remember I had in there, and thinking, oh, that would be great in the book. Although I don't know if like you said, if they would want that in there. And I think overall, and, you're a far more experienced author and journalist, so I might have taken the wrong approach, but I think I erred on the side of I wanted it because they were going through such a trying time, and they're at the earliest phase of their careers, and they're about to launch into these long years of residency, of training, and then of applications to the next stage. And that's one of the things that particularly overwhelms me whenever I learn about medicine, is that for every round of training you go through, there's just a whole nother set of applications and hoops to jump through. And I think I wanted it to be something that they would be really proud of, and in a sort of unmitigated way, since they had just been through some of the kind of toughest moments of their lives and careers so far. So I do think I kind of erred on the side of thinking of wanting to paint them as the professional people who they presented themselves to me as. And I did sort of go carefully over any details that I had questions about them wanting me to include. I think I drove them pretty insane, kind of calling them constantly and asking about every little detail. I thought they were going to block my number at some point, but they didn't. But I think that it's something that I continuously wrestle with, and particularly in other features for the Times too, because I think in the Times, sometimes I'll be reporting a feature, and again, especially since I've been writing a lot about younger people and younger doctors, there is that kind of strangeness to the relationship where you do sometimes feel like you're talking to a friend, but then you have to kind of remind people that the tape recorder is running and that it is like an interview. And so I am kind of always wrestling with that question of when to decide to draw boundaries, and what really needs to be included to serve the reader. Because ultimately, I think the point of all these stories is to serve the reader and to serve the communities that these doctors are part of, who want to see themselves reflected in these kinds of stories. So I think with every detail, I was kind of wondering at the end of the day, who is this serving, and if it's going to go in, is it absolutely necessary to tell the story, to illuminate what was happening, and to paint a fair and respectful and really almost like loving portrait of the doctors who are in this.
And they are truly remarkable characters. I don't want to ask you if you have a favorite character. That may be asking, me if I have a favorite child, but can you choose one who's just particularly striking, and just share a little bit about that person's story and why you found them so moving?
Yeah, well, one story in the book that really, really touched me, and I think has just stayed with me ever since the moments when I first started reporting it, was about a young doctor named Jay, who took in a patient who his name is Manny, and this is a young man who has Down syndrome. And he lived with his father in a housing project in New York, and his father fell sick with COVID. And Manny, who has Down syndrome, his father was his only living relative, so he came with him to the hospital and was sitting next to him in his dad's hospital room. And he was there for days and days as his dad was getting sicker and sicker and was put on a ventilator. And ultimately, Manny's father ended up passing away. And then Manny himself got COVID and was admitted to the hospital as a patient. And he ended up being at the hospital for 100 days because the hospital staff didn't know what to do with him because he had no other living relatives after he had lost his father. And they were kind of trying to figure out, first of all, how to treat him of COVID. And second of all, how to make sure he had a safe plan for discharge and for release from the hospital. And what just completely touched me about this story was how much every single doctor in the hospital, particularly Jay, who is the young woman I was following, but also every other social worker and doctor, completely rallied around this young man. And they would all, they would visit him on their lunch hours. They would stay late in the evenings to take care of him. They would bring him stuffed animals and puzzles and clothes. And actually one of the hospital staff members even started to look into the possibility of adopting him. So it was the most challenging moment in New York. They were completely overloaded with patients. All you could hear in the streets were sirens, and still these doctors wanted to go completely above and beyond to take care of this young man and to make him feel really loved. And they would send me videos of like concerts they put on for him in the hallways. And to me, that story was it stuck with me because I think it just points to the real, like, I think the word heroism feels so cliche, but there is sort of no other word for people who at the most stressful moments of their lives were just going completely above and beyond to make patients feel embraced and loved and cared for. And they did not care whether that meant staying an extra 2 hours on top of their 12-hour shifts. They were just, giving their full selves over to caring for these patients. And so I think that's a story that's really stuck with me, and that I think points to just especially Jay as a young woman who's around my age and could put 14 hours a day into caring for someone whose case seemed so challenging, so complicated, and at some points even hopeless. That for me was just like a real touching thing to follow.
And at a time that they were going all out for and risking their lives. Was there some frustration among them about the degree to which this had been politicized? You know, to pronouncements from the White House about how this was going to go away, or maybe patients who didn't want to, I don't know, who didn't want to wear masks, or didn't, or referred to it as a Chinese virus, or just who reacted in ways that felt offensive or dangerous to the doctors. Did that come up?
Yeah, I think there was certainly a real sense of frustration that, these are all, the doctors I was following are all young, in their mid-20s, and they feel like they are giving absolutely everything, putting their own bodies and lives and partners at risk. And then they're seeing communities that are just completely refusing to take the risk seriously. I think that was, in some cases, frustrating, in some cases just really painful for them to see, because you sort of start to feel at some points like you're just losing it, that you're giving everything, you're giving all your time, your life is completely at risk, and then you're seeing other people either laugh it off or doubt it or undermine it, or just for no real reason refuse to take kind of basic precautions. So I think that was a real source of frustration. And I do think at the same time, there was a real poignancy for them in the fact that their weeks in the COVID wards and this really kind of pivotal moment in their careers was intersecting with what we saw as a real moment of reckoning in the country over racial injustice. And I think for doctors, for the doctors of color who I followed, and for white doctors too, there was a real poignancy in the fact that first they were on one kind of front line treating patients and seeing the racial disparities of the virus just playing out in front of their eyes in terms of the patients they were taking in. And then weeks later, they were able to go out and be on another sort of front line. And I think almost all the young doctors I followed were involved in the protests and were marching, and in some cases marching with fellow doctors. And I think that was a real moment of poignancy for them to see the reckoning that was going on in the hospitals and the spotlight that had been put on racial health disparities, to then see that kind of taken out to the streets. That was powerful for them.
And can you talk a little bit about those disparities? I mean, COVID obviously disproportionately was killing people of color, and the numbers were huge, even though it maybe didn't. I wonder if, to what extent that that generated a sense of outrage, and or alternatively, ideas about how we combat that kind of health disparity and the larger causes of health inequity in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that was one of the striking things to the doctors I was speaking to is how visible that was right away. In the early weeks of COVID in New York, Black New Yorkers were dying at double the rate of white New Yorkers. And Hispanic New Yorkers were also dying at around double the rate. In a lot of cases, that was because people from communities of color had less of an ability to socially distance and socially isolate. They were disproportionately represented among people who were working kind of frontline jobs. And I think that for a lot of the doctors, it did point to a sort of underlying sense of why, when we talk about representation in the medical field and the push to diversify the pipeline and to make the medical field more representative of the country at large, I think it shows why none of that is kind of theoretical or abstract or a sort of nice to have. It has real health consequences, because there's more and more research showing that that when patients are able to be treated by doctors who look like them, for example, when Black patients have Black doctors, that in a lot of cases that leads to better health outcomes for them. They're more likely to agree to preventive measures like cholesterol tests or diabetes screenings. So I think there's a real sense that 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 representation in the medical field, the diversity, that these are things with health consequences, sometimes even life or death stakes. So I think that particularly in the weeks of the pandemic, of the pandemic's first wave in New York, as those racial disparities were put on display, I think that there was even more of a sense of kind of gravity behind conversations about representation in medicine, and it just displayed so clearly why that's so critical.
And so how do we, this is an issue that you've also written about for the Times, how do we diversify the pipeline of doctors to be?
Yeah, I think that it kind of starts at both ends of the pipeline, because first of all, at the top, there's so little representation of Black doctors in the leadership of medical institutions, so little in the faculty of medical schools. And actually, there's been a lot of high profile instances recently in which Black doctors at the top of their field have been pushed out of medical institutions. There was a high profile case at Tulane of a woman who was fired, who had been their first Black woman to lead a residency program. And so you're seeing actually leadership in the field who are more representative of this new generation are being pushed out. And then at the other end of the pipeline, I think that despite all the sort of conversation about the need to diversify medicine, there isn't always a real willingness to look at the deepest layers of what's holding people back and of what is kind of keeping the pipeline so narrow. And I think one of those is all the real like invisible costs of getting a degree, of getting an MD. And it's not just medical school tuition, which is very costly, but it's also even taking the MCAT or flying to medical schools to interview at places, or, there's all sorts of study guides that actually cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. And there are exams that cost thousands of dollars. So there's layers and layers of costs, some of them kind of invisible to the higher ups in the field. And I think there isn't always a willingness to engage with what it really means to open the pipeline, and not just kind of pay lip service to the need for diversity, but to really look at all the layers of what's been keeping the field so kind of white and moneyed for so long.
You've written a lot about health and medical care, even before this book. I wonder if do you ever think about going to medical school yourself? Is that an option today? Is that something you've been at all inspired to think about?
I think that my math and science skills are so poor that it's not exactly an option for me, but it's one of the reasons that I enjoy covering medicine so much, is that it allows me as a journalist to ask like the very dumbest questions and to ask over and over for people to walk me through things like I'm a child, so that I can explain it to readers in a real understandable way. And that's one of the things that I love about covering the culture of medicine, is that it's such a critical thing that impacts all of our lives, in some ways in a real like life or death way. It has like visceral and in some cases like real fatal stakes for people. And yet I think sometimes there's so much jargon and big words and just kind of complex terminology that I think there aren't always lots of layers of communication between people in the medical field and lay people who just interact with it as patients. So for me, it's like a real joy getting to cover it and ask the dumb questions that I would like to know, and ask them under the guise of reporting instead of just kind of a pesky, curious person.
One of the great joys of journalism, of course. And folks who are watching, I'm going to come to your questions in a moment. So please do add them to the Q&A box. I wonder, so the folks who wrote about, they've been through this for about a year now. How are they doing? How are they doing, emotionally, psychologically? Have they been traumatized? Are they getting over that? Are they, how do they feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, they are doing remarkably well in a lot of different ways. One is that they're all vaccinated. They're all working extremely hard, but also thriving in different fields. And it's been fascinating to talk with some of them as they've transitioned from treating COVID patients to going into their normal residency programs. One of them is a pediatrician, and another one is actually also training in pediatrics. another one in the emergency room. And it's fascinating to hear about their transition from the kind of really fast moving COVID wards to doing the work that they'd actually been mentally preparing to do for all their years of medical school. And I think one of the most special things has been getting to see some of them in person in the last few days. I had a Shabbat dinner with some of them the other day, and we were able to eat inside. And to think that, we were going from just under a year ago talking while they were in and out of the COVID wards to having an indoor dinner felt both miraculous and kind of surreal.
What are the policy lessons that we take away from this? The White House isn't so far from politics and prose. If folks there are watching, then what lessons should they take away from the experience of these doctors about maybe it's, what we do with medical education, with the health system, with the next pandemic? Are there some policy lessons you picked up over the last year in terms of lessons learned?
Yeah, there is one kind of interesting issue that you wouldn't think necessarily intersects with the political, but it is something that Congress is actually wrestling with, particularly actually Senator Bernie Sanders has been a leader on this, but there's a real impending shortage of doctors in the US. There could be a shortage of up to 140,000 in just the next decade. And one of the underlying reasons for that is that that residency positions, federally funded residency positions in the US are capped right now under a kind of 1997 law. And there's all sorts of pieces of legislation floating around in Congress right now to create more federally funded residency positions. And I think from following the young doctors I did for this book, it's just clear that the US medical system is under so much strain. And I think we saw that just in the moment as the crisis was really fully hitting the US and as it was like coming head on, there was just a real worry that hospital staff was going to be stretched far too thin, particularly as people were being burnt out or even falling sick. And I think it's kind of fascinating to see that there's a real opportunity to do something about that burnout and the shortage right now. There's all kinds of pieces of legislation that are currently being considered, including the Resident Physician Shortage Act. And so there are options on the table to kind of address the next time a crisis comes up like this. There are options so that the staff isn't stretched so thin, and so that we also don't necessarily have to be pulling young people onto the front lines, even if they are extremely capable and courageous and able to do the work.
Yeah. It makes eminent sense to increase the number of residencies and probably also to make it easier for foreign doctors to practice medicine in the U.S. and probably give nurse practitioners more room to do more in the U.S. Although a lot of doctors would disagree, and maybe your subjects would too. But there's some questions that I want to go through here. There are a couple of questions about burnout, which of course is a huge issue in medicine, and certainly young doctors. One says physician burnout continues to be an issue for all doctors during this time, especially. But I'm interested in what additional burden or nuances there may be for these doctors being so new in their profession and navigating the front lines of a epidemic like this. And then the same person or somebody else asks, did some of the doctors burn out or just become disenchanted with a sense of hopelessness?
That's a great question. At the risk of sounding like the sort of hype woman for these 6 doctors who I followed, they happen to be a group that actually, by the end of, particularly in recent weeks, but even really at the end of their weeks on the front lines in the COVID wards, a lot of them spoke to the fact that the experience just really reaffirmed their commitment to doing the work that they've been doing and to being, at the bedsides of patients. And I think in some cases, the pandemic made it so difficult to do some of the basic kind of aspects of patient care that they were drawn to do. For example, families couldn't be in the room with the patients. So as a doctor, you couldn't get to know the family. You couldn't really linger at the bedsides, or in some cases, you couldn't really hold the patient's hands. So there were all of these aspects of typical medical care that disappeared. And I think for some of them, they emerged from the crisis with a real desire to keep doing the work and to kind of just go back to the real sorts of deep relationship building that typically comes with medicine. So I think certainly there was like a kind of burnout with the challenges of COVID care specifically, but I think it also affirmed for a lot of them their desire to keep doing that, and to keep doing that as some of those challenges disappear, and as we emerge on the other side of the crisis in the US.
Eva asks, did any seek psychotherapy in the aftermath? And, more broadly, I guess, whether or not they sought therapy, who did they get comfort from? Who did they turn to? Was it turning to each other, to families? I mean, it's such a difficult thing to go through that they must find consolation in somebody.
Yeah, I think it did differ. For some of them had a real tight sense of community with the other students who had graduated alongside them and gone to the front lines. I think a lot of them found a real sense of strength in their teams in the hospitals. And what that was one of the things I found fascinating in talking with various doctors as I was reporting this book, is there was a real sense of kind of togetherness and collaboration and cooperation that emerged during the pandemic. And I think it was in so many hospitals, the sense of kind of all hands on deck was so powerful and so strong that for the young doctors, it could be really affirming and empowering, because they were working directly alongside some of the oldest and most senior doctors. And in some cases, they even really had the same level of knowledge about COVID as the most experienced doctors, because the virus was so novel and the disease was so novel. So there was a sort of, sense of the hierarchy being upended, and a real sense of togetherness. And I think in that sense, the medical teams were really able to work alongside one another and support one another emotionally, as well as in the course of doing their work. But in terms of also seeking out mental health support, I think that was a challenge, mostly because they were so stretched for time during the weeks of the COVID crisis that I think a lot of them actually just didn't really have the actual day-to-day time to, or felt they didn't, to seek out mental health support. And I do think that's kind of one of the major questions that's going to continue to be live for both doctors and for reporters covering the profession is, what does it mean to care for the caretakers? And what does it mean to provide real deep mental health support for the people who just experienced this traumatic situation and this real crisis of care? And I think that's something that's going to continue to be a critical question for leaders in the medical field and in medical education to wrestle with.
Especially early on in the pandemic, there were PPE shortages in general. And I think a lot of doctors and health workers were quite nervous about whether PPE was adequate. Were there anxieties about the adequacy of the PPE that was provided? Were there tensions among different doctors, some feeling that, they just need a mask, and, somebody else says, oh no, I want, a full suit and double masking, et cetera, double gloving, and so on. Was that a source of conflict or tension?
Well, this was something that I think was really terrifying for a lot of doctors in New York City, particularly in the early weeks of the crisis in New York. And I remember seeing this emerge in some of your reporting too, Nick, where you were reporting in Montefiore and on the experience of other doctors. And I think that there was, a moment of terror where there were these headlines coming out about the hospitals feeling like war zones and doctors having to wear garbage bags or, reuse one N95 for days. And there was one of the young women I followed, Jay, in her first day in the wards. I remember she found out that she would just get, I think it was one N95 per week. And she had just this jolt of terror of feeling like that's not enough and there's nothing you can kind of do. And she just, marched right in. And the shortages did start to let up as time went on. But I think starting out, there was a real sense of fear for some of them because they knew that the PPE was going to be the most critical thing for them. And that was the most important thing for protecting their own health. So that was a pretty terrifying reality. I do think that the positive was that the shortages did start to kind of let up as the weeks went on and as supply chains were smoothed out a little bit. And so all of them that I followed actually did thankfully get the PPE they needed throughout and never had to do anything where they were completely exposed. I think it also is worth noting that none of them fell sick in the hospitals. And it was a real testament to the fact that the PPE did work. And those of them who did fall sick actually fell sick outside the context of the hospital. So visiting friends or family, but it wasn't treating patients. So I think it was a real testament to the efficacy of the PPE when they got it.
Scott says, I was wondering if the doctors you followed have shared their feelings about working with colleagues who choose not to be vaccinated. And I guess I would just add to that, more broadly, these doctors are seeing people die from COVID. Is it frustrating to them when they, run into people, friends maybe, who have refused to be vaccinated and think it's all a hoax, et cetera?
Yeah, the vaccines for all of them, and I remember most of them, I think, got it in December, and they were texting me that it just felt like a real miracle, that really just a little over 6 months after they were first coming into the COVID wards, they were able to get a vaccine, which at some points had felt like an impossible timeline to them. And I think to a lot of people who are watching this crisis. And I do think that there is definitely a deep sense of frustration now with people who are choosing not to get vaccinated. And on the other hand, I think a lot of them are approaching this as they have so many other aspects of their medical care with an emphasis on the power of kind of personal relationships and direct conversation. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of the coverage of vaccine hesitancy too, is that there's a real power in just kind of continuing to return to communities where there's hesitancy, make it really accessible, catalyze like deep conversations about what anxieties or fears people might have, and just make it as easy as possible to access and as easy as possible to have direct and deep conversation about what it looks like to get the vaccine and where people's worries come from. I think that there's just an understanding that there's nothing as powerful as direct conversation to overcome those hurdles. Just like in all other aspects of medical care, that trust is so important.
Tim notes that you wrote this book at warp speed. You truly did. I mean, normally one might submit a manuscript to the publisher a year before publication. And, some of these events were barely happening a year before publication. You and the publisher deserve special applause for turning it out so quickly and so well. Tim asks, he says it's very inspiring, but what did you learn about yourself writing such an important book in warp speed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that following a group of young people who were doing something so courageous and so kind of powerful during a moment of crisis, I think for me that was secondhand. I drew a lot of inspiration from that, because I think in the early weeks of the COVID crisis, for a lot of journalists, there was a sense of sort of just paralysis of not knowing as journalists how we were going to do our work. And I'm sure, Nick, this was the case for you too, even though you were very quickly in the hospitals reporting in person. But it was really challenging to be in our homes, and whether it was doom scrolling Twitter or doom scrolling the headlines, not exactly knowing how to engage with the crisis and do something constructive and useful. So I think for me, there was something so powerful in being able to follow a group of people who were doing something really constructive, and then for myself do something as sort of helpful and hopefully in some ways contributing as much as possible. Because I think that we're all going to sort of be involved in documenting this moment and documenting what it looks like for future readers and for future people to make sense of it. And so I think for me, as a person around the same age as these doctors who were doing something so powerful, it was just kind of comforting to be able to make some sort of contribution at a moment when there was so much kind of paralysis and just lack of understanding about how to engage constructively.
Mackie says, is there something that stumped or troubled you in the course of writing the book that you can't stop thinking about, that you want to explore in your next big project?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question too. That's a tough one. I would say almost everything, stumped me at first. I was very lost about how to put all the threads together and to make it a real coherent narrative. And I think that something that just continues to interest me is, what does it look like to really constructively think about diversifying medicine, and again, not just in a paying lip service way, but in a way that really changes the pipeline and changes the face of medicine, all the way from the leadership to the newest classes of people entering medical schools. And it was something that I got into a little bit of the history of medical education in the book, and it was fascinating to me to learn that that the medicine in the US actually got a lot whiter and a lot kind of wealthier and more elite after the early 1900s, that there used to be a lot more Black medical schools than there are now. And most of them were shut down as kind of this wave of this effort to make medicine a more elite and restrictive field. And so I'm just continue to wonder, sort of more than 100 years after that effort, is there really a good faith effort happening to change the medical field, change its practices, its norms, its face and culture, and what can that really look like in the most powerful way possible, and in a way that's not just kind of lip service.
Well, that feeds nicely into a question from Andrea, who says that, as the mother of a young doctor who spent my career focused on wealth inequality, we need to reinvent how we finance medical education the same way we're thinking about how we finance college. But where do you start this process? And of course, in a number of other countries, medical education is free or heavily subsidized, but then incomes for doctors are much lower, which also means that expenses are far lower. I mean, should we be going in that direction?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And I think there's so many layers I agree. So many of the challenges are structural. They're not just cultural, and they involve really looking at, like you said, Andrea, the financing and what that means, all the way down to the bills people pay. And I do think that there's interesting things happening at some schools which are choosing to make tuition free, like, for example, NYU, or like Kaiser Permanente on the West Coast. And on the other hand, I think, I was speaking with some doctors recently who said that they hadn't chosen NYU because they didn't really believe that it was going to be free, or they thought there was going to be some kind of catch there. And so I think that there's so many layers of complexity, and it might, in like really changing medicine and the healthcare system here will probably involve or will have to involve some real like wholesale reform. And that could also look like, changing the insurance system. There's obviously, coming out of the last election, there's a lot of conversation about Medicare for all, or what that could mean. So I think that there's big questions to be wrestled with. And I think giving a microphone to young people in the field, to young doctors in training, and doctors in medical school, I think passing the microphone to them is also really important, and making sure they have a platform to inform what policies continue to look like going forward.
I think Walter Cronkite said something about how America's healthcare system wasn't healthy, wasn't caring, wasn't a system. And I wonder to what extent the physicians you were writing about felt that they were putting Bandaids on this kind of dysfunctional system where people were exposed to risks they couldn't control, where they didn't have insurance, and so were worried about getting care, in ways that might expose others. They couldn't take sick leave, so they might have worked when they were in a position to transmit the virus. Did they have this larger kind of frustration with the bankruptcy, if you will, of the healthcare system?
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you put that, because I think putting Band-Aids on a broken system is that just encapsulates it. And I think what I heard from them was, to some degree, medicine is such a long, arduous training process that it's sort of hard to zoom out and see the big picture until you're really far along in your training, and then you're a little bit more entrenched in the system as it is. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that medical training is such an expensive and long and difficult process. It involves, so many exams, and then you're working 80-hour weeks as a resident and making very little money, and you kind of keep your head down and move along. And then by the time you kind of pick your head up and start to look at the system as a whole, you're so far along that it's almost impossible to imagine it changing wholesale. And so I do think that it's hard as a young doctor to zoom out and take in the big picture of the brokenness in the system, because if you do that, then I'd imagine you might just get so disillusioned that it's hard to kind of keep pushing through the difficulties of the training. And I think that is one of the challenges of medicine, that by the time you get to the top, you're kind of pretty entrenched in the system as it is. And it's hard to pick your head up and look at it earlier on, because it's so challenging.
Allison asks, Emma, wondering what surprised you the most as you reported for this book?
I think what surprised me the most was just, I think, learning how much people who are diving into medicine, that as much as there are so many particulars to master in terms of the clinical aspects of medicine, they're also just constantly wrestling with the real theoretical and abstract and like meta considerations too, and that they're constantly thinking about what it means to build the deepest and most kind of respectful patient-doctor relationships. They're thinking about, what it means to sit next to a patient who's on a ventilator and nonverbal and can't really speak or communicate, but still talking to that person just to kind of honor who they are as not just a body, but as like a full human. That I think I was just kind of, really admired that ability that they had to balance like both all the tiny particularities of what it means to like suture a wound or, get in an IV or whatever it was. They balance that with these big picture considerations that are ultimately about the quality of care someone receives. And so that was something that both impressed and just really inspired me.
Maybe a last question. Catherine asks, how did this exposure impact your own views of life and death? And I wonder in particular whether, what led you to think about or have conversations about, did you want do not resuscitate orders? Did you have conversations with your parents or grandparents about things like that? Did it frame how you thought we should be addressing these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I would say that was probably one of the most fascinating aspects for me of the whole reporting. So I remember when I was growing up, my mom always used to say, like at a certain point when she was older, she would just say, like, if I'm, not in a good state or I can't recover from something, just get the pillow and smother me. That was fine. And I wanted to ask at a certain point, all the doctors in the book, what they had concluded about their own desires for end of life care. And I kept putting off the question and thinking it was going to be so tactless to ask. And then the minute I asked all of them, they approached it like it was the least surprising question in the world. They all had given it a ton of thought, talked about it with their partners, talked about it with their families. And, all of them had really thought out at what point they might want, do not resuscitate orders or things like that. And I think being able to approach those questions with that degree of informality and of just openness is a really powerful thing. And it's something that feels so unnatural. And I remember that from my own conversations with my mom, but I think can be one of the most powerful things for both patient-doctor relationships and for making sure that people get, quality end-of-life care. So I think seeing how the doctors were able to approach it with such, just complete openness and honesty and that was something that was really amazing to me to see, because it gave me a lot of hope about how my own family and other families I know can talk about those thorny issues.
Well, thank you, Emma, for giving us not only an extraordinary portrait of that time, but also that hope that you mentioned. And for those who haven't seen it, there it is, and much recommended from a tremendous new author. And so, thank you. And I guess over to Chelsea.
Thank you, and happy birthday, Emma. Thank you for joining us on your big day. I think I speak for everyone out there when I say I wish we had another hour. It's been a really riveting conversation. I want to thank you, Emma Goldberg and Nick Kristof, for joining us this evening. Thank you all out there for coming. Your patronage is what allows Politics and Prose to host wonderful chats like this. We can't continue to do it without the book sales to support it. So as a gentle reminder, I've put the book link in the chat. It'll take you to the Politics and Prose website. While you're there, check out our events page. We hope to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick and Chelsea and everyone who came.
Take care. Congrats on the book.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for the great question.